Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week, President Biden met with top congressional leaders to talk about the debt ceiling. This meeting came 4 months after the U.S. hit the debt limit, and just a few weeks before a potential default. Considering the high stakes in this looming debt crisis, it's remarkable that it took this long for the president to sit down with the 4 leaders and to talk about how to solve this problem together. A debt default, of course, would set off an unprecedented economic crisis and inflict real pain on families all across the country. We all know our economy is just trying to get back on its feet after COVID. Our banking system has endured 3 high-profile collapses, and inflation continues to wreak havoc on family budgets. If the U.S. defaults on its debt, those challenges will only intensify, and that is an understatement. Social Security and Medicare benefits could be delayed. Members of the military and Border Patrol would be left without a paycheck. And we would see our economy reeling, skyrocketing mortgage rates, sinking stock prices, and instability across our economy. Given the already fragile state of the economy, a default is the very last thing we need. Fortunately, that's a point of agreement between the parties. I haven't heard anybody say it would be a good idea for us to default. But the $31.7 trillion question is, what does the path forward look like? As the American people know, the Republican position is not shrouded in mystery. My Republican colleagues and I have said over and over that a clean debt ceiling is not an option, a clean debt ceiling increase. It simply doesn't have the votes to pass the House or the Senate, making it a non-starter, so we should move on. In order to have a chance of passing both chambers of Congress, a debt ceiling increase must come with some spending reforms. You would think President Biden, after all of his years serving in the Senate, now as President of the United States, would understand that $31.7 trillion in debt is unsustainable. That's just common sense. But the president has dragged his feet for the last 4 months, saying he would not negotiate. Until now, it looks like he grudgingly is acknowledging that he has to negotiate, which he knew or should have known all along. Thanks to the leadership of Speaker McCarthy, the House of Representatives passed a bill last month to avert the debt crisis. I think President Biden actually thought that the Speaker and the House would be unsuccessful in passing any increase in the debt ceiling. So he was happy to sit back, hoping that they would fail, and then they'd come running to him and agree to his demands. But by passing a House bill, they put the ball in President Biden's court and put the onus on him to drop his no negotiations, no reforms position, which was absolutely ridiculous in the first place. For months, the president has said he won't negotiate. He ruled out negotiations over any spending reforms, even though he signed into law trillions of dollars in new debt, which has caused us to come to this juncture in the first place. He said he expects Congress to raise the debt ceiling with no conditions attached and let the runaway spending spree continue. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you've maxed out your credit card, your credit union or your bank is going to say, well, if you want an increase in your spending limit, you got to talk to us about how you're going to pay this money back. Those are the sorts of conversations that would occur in our daily lives, and those are the sorts of conversations that the president should have started to have 4 months ago. Before the president's meeting with congressional leaders last week, his advisors parroted his same no negotiations, no reforms message. The White House insisted time and time again that the president wouldn't drop his demand for a clean debt ceiling increase. Now we've seen a massive shift in the president's rhetoric. I'm actually grateful that he's made that shift in his rhetoric, because his earlier position was completely irresponsible and unsustainable. But now over the weekend, the president was asked about the status of conversations with Republicans about the debt ceiling. He said, quote, "It's never good to characterize a negotiation in the middle of a negotiation." So there he goes, using the N word, negotiation, when he said he wouldn't negotiate. And while he offered no insight into the discussions themselves, the fact that he described them as negotiations actually marks a major turning point. After insisting for months that he wouldn't negotiate, the president has finally caved in, as we knew he ultimately would. He's finally accepted the inevitable reality that a bipartisan compromise is the only way to avoid a debt crisis. But that's been obvious from day one. We have a Democrat majority in the Senate, a Republican majority in the House, and a Democrat in the White House. We know that in order to pass a bill, all two branches of Congress and the executive branch would have to agree on something. So it's, by definition, it has to be bipartisan. And that's the baseline for success in divided government. It really is baffling why it took so long for the president to come to terms with this reality, particularly given his long experience as a member of this body, the United States Senate. But I'm glad he got off the sidelines finally, and now is at the negotiating table with Speaker McCarthy. Reportedly, White House and congressional aides worked over the weekend trying to identify the framework for a deal. And the president, as I said, will meet with congressional leaders again today. The White House is projecting a great deal of optimism, and I hope that's warranted. I hope that means they'll come with a serious offer, but we still have a long way to go. Because once a deal is reached, there's still going to be a lot of work that needs to be done. First, the agreement needs to be translated into legislative language. Once the bill's completed, members need time to review it. Then the bill has to pass both chambers of Congress. This is a process that can occur over several days or much longer. But remember, Secretary Yellen said that the U.S. could default as early as June the 1st, which is 16 days away. With this as a backdrop, President Biden's planning to hop on a plane to Japan tomorrow. We're 2 weeks away from a potential economic disaster, largely of the president's own making for taking his ridiculous no negotiation stance for the last 4 months. But we're 2 weeks away now from a potential economic disaster. Bipartisan discussions have begun, and the president still planning to go overseas. The president spent months refusing to negotiate. He said he wouldn't even entertain the idea of negotiations to avoid a debt crisis. Now the president is at the negotiating table. This isn't a time to get up, walk away, and jump on Air Force One and go overseas. He can't fly halfway around the globe just as negotiations are gaining momentum. Because as he accurately said, the U.S. cannot default on its debts over the next 2 weeks. So it's crunch time. It's time to roll up their sleeves, get to work, and to work this out. Speaker McCarthy and the House of Representatives have been ready to negotiate since the beginning. But the president wasted months that could have been spent on hashing out a bipartisan compromise to avoid a debt crisis. And he knew it from the very beginning that ultimately he would have to negotiate. So now's the time for the president to take this crisis seriously and to own his responsibility to negotiate a successful outcome. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.